Alright guys, so we're going to start by doing our first technique, wet on wet, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little better. So in the first row, these are pretty standard watercolor techniques. These are like the basics and the ones that you'll use the most. But the first word refers to the paint, the second word refers to the paper. So wet on wet means wet paint on wet paper. So I put this one first because that's when I know your water is the cleanest. So you're going to start off this one by dipping your brush into your water, and you are just going to paint water onto your paper. So you're probably not using real watercolor paper. We're not. We're just using like thick drawing paper, but it'll still give you a similar effect. You should not be using copy paper though. Copy paper would be a disaster. All right, so I've wet the paper. Now I am going to, let's see, where's it? I am going to dip my brush in the watercolor, because if you touch your watercolors, you'll notice that they don't do anything when you touch them until you activate them, and you activate them by putting water on them. So I'm going to do a color scheme of, let's see, I'm going to do cool colors, violet, blue, and green. So for my wet on wet, I've already wet the paper a little bit. Now I'm going to get my paint. I'm going to use blue, and I want this to be really watery. You can use your lid if you want to kind of create a palette, or in my class we have these like little extra, we have like actual palettes, but when you put the wet watercolor onto the paper, it should kind of be really transparent and kind of puddle, and yeah. Oh, you guys in my class, you're going to pour your water from your pitcher into your cup so that you don't contaminate all the clean water, because you'll have to dump your water a couple times. So I kind of got mine a little too wet, but pour yourself a glass. All right, so that's just wet on wet. Wet paint onto wet paper. And I'm going to do it here too. Don't be afraid. The worst that can happen is you tear your paper and you go.
Not again. What?
Ooh. Having fun. You just kind of add water to it.
I didn't talk about that. This is not up for discussion.
Pour out the water, pour out the paint. And I'm demonstrating on this big one too, which is kind of fun. Okay, so there you go. It should look really pale and transparent. That's wet on wet. So now we're going to do wet on dry. Wet on dry is wet paint on dry paper. So we don't do anything to the paper. We just activate our paint the same way that we did before. So to activate the paint, you have to add water to it.
Are we doing green then?
You can use whatever colors you want.
They have to be like cool colors?
Nope. You can do
So
whatever.
what are you doing next?
I am going to do violet next. But you don't have to. Alright, so to activate my color, I have to dip it in water. And you don't have to use the palette all the time. It's just if you want to. But, so I am taking, this is like the dirtiest palette, oh my gosh. I'm going to go for purple. It's dry paper. wet on dry. So this is how you're probably used to painting with watercolors. This is like what you would kind of draw with. You know what? I'm feeling kind of squirrely. Let's go ahead and I'm going to put some blue in here too. What? Yep, I know. So that is wet on dry. Paint is wet, but the paper is dry. I'm going to switch this palette, it's a little better.
Artwork for sale. Dry just do nothing. It doesn't work unless you activate it.
Nah, not really. Nice try.
Turkey. I like turkey.
I'm painting this the big
Wow,
one.
wow.
So you have a paper towel to kind of blot if you get too much water on it. You can also like use a newspaper. Did I mess up the order? I messed it on here. Oh well. Okay. So next we are going to do dry on wet. So that means the paint is going to be dry, but the paper is going to be wet. Wait a second, how do we do that? If we need water to activate it. So I'm going to show you. You need to make sure your brush is clean first. I'm rinsing it, and then I'm going to wipe it clean. Your water should still be okay, but if you're noticing that your water is not transparent anymore, you want to dump it. So I'm going to wet my paper just a little bit. The first one I kind of made too saturated. Did you get watercolor on you? Okay, good. Because it is poisonous. I'm just kidding. It's not. It's just.
It is poisonous. If you touch your skin, you will immediately die.
Yeah.
No pressure.
No.
Pressure.
Okay, so I am going to get dry paint. Again, like, whoa, but I have to activate it. So you're going to activate the paint by wetting your brush and then rubbing the paint onto your next color. But then before you go down to paint, kind of dry it. And so this should give you like a really... Yeah, kind of blot the brush. So my paper is not quite wet enough. I want there to be like a puddle. Yeah, wet the paper first so it's almost like a little pool, because what I want to happen is when I put the brush down, it's going to like make it bleed a little bit. There we go. So it's like I'm activating it on the paper instead of ahead of time, because the water is waiting for the paint.
How do I make it dry on my brush?
Blot it with a paper towel. It's supposed to kind of bleed into the water that you have puddled into your paper. This isn't the greatest watercolor paper that I gave you guys. It's just like drawing paper, so... It should kind of like bleed into like the fibers of the paper. This is what I'm going for. But to get the watercolors dry, I'm kind of, I'm getting it wet enough to get the color on, but then I'm blotting it in my paper towel and then letting it bleed into the paper. So it's, oh, I just broke my paintbrush. I just decapitated my paintbrush. Oh no. Sorry, buddy. What is that noise? Oh. Yes, it was very responsible.
So just first
The first one means the paint. Alright, so that is dry on wet.
Why is my purple so blue? This is crazy. My purple is blue. Because it's blue, not purple. No, because I already used blue. This one has to be purple. I don't have purple on mine.
Yeah, everyone's got like different. I ordered a. Blue violet. Blue violet. Alright guys, let's move on to the next one. Dry on dry. You'll use this one the least. But dry paper, dry paint. So this is going to kind of look scratchy. There's dry on dry. So this is good for like, if you wanted like rough grass. See how it's kind of scratchy? You just get it wet enough so that it actually puts color on, but you're almost like pushing, you're forcing the color on. So you'll blot it before you lay it down. So it's going to look really scratchy. This would be good for doing like fur on an animal or there you go. Watercolor. So it can be really scratchy and dry. Really scratchy and dry. Dry and dry.
You literally just take the paint, put it on the thing.
Yep.
It's not even one brush.
How are those Dollar Tree paints? You're fine. You can work with it. I bought them.
This is not.
Yep. Alright guys, so that is our first row. Those are the most basic watercolor techniques. Wet on wet, wet on dry, dry on wet, and then dry on dry. Say what?
It's not coming off the brush.
It's not. Use your paper towel to help it.
Oh.
Alright, so now we're going to go to our next row. Wash, gradual wash, color glaze, and color bleed.
It's still not coming off.
I'm going to pause. I'm going to do another video just so it's not so long. So that's our first row.